Okay, so welcome. It's Thursday. I have to remember what day we are on here. Part 3 with Rabbi Avi Strausberg, Love, Sex, and Relationships in Jewish Tradition. Today is dedicated to the delicate art of Tokhehah. This program is sponsored by CSP, Orange County Community Scholar Program, which is in its 20th year. A few upcoming programs for you to watch out for. This Sunday, we'll be back with Paul Lipps in part 2 of his series, Creating a Nation, this time focusing on Moroccan Jews. Next week, May 12th, which is Tuesday, I believe, Robbie Greengrass is back with us. Everything you need to know about Israel through the songs of Hadar Nachash. And then next Thursday, again, May 14th, we'll be back with Rabbi Avi for part 4 of this series, Love, Sex, and Relationships in Jewish Tradition. And that one will be focusing on Desire Gone Wild. Note that the CSP annual fundraiser is coming up soon, so please support CSP. I'm sure you'll be hearing from Ari about that. Speaking of Ari, if you are not on his email list, which I'm sure you are, but just in case you're not, aricats18@gmail.com. That's ARIE cats18@gmail.com. He'll add you. And let me just give a little introduction to Rav Avi, and then I'll hand it over to her. So Rav Avi is the Director of National Learning Initiatives at Hadar and is based in Washington, D.C. She received her rabbinic ordination from Hebrew College in Boston and is a Wexner Graduate Fellow. She also holds a master's in Jewish education. Energized by engaging creatively with Jewish text, she has written several theater pieces inspired by the Torah and maintains a Daf Yomi haiku blog in which she writes daily Talmudic haikus. So I'm about to hand it over to Rav Avi. We're going to stay on mute throughout the presentation, but I know that Rav Avi may invite you to engage with the chat. I'll let her handle that, and then we can have more interaction from that. So Rav Avi, it's all yours.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Avi Strausberg. It's so great to be back with you for our 3rd session. Those of you who are repeat comers, thank you for continuing to learn. And if this is your first time tuning in, I'm excited to get to learn and to get to know you as well. So in our sessions together, we have been exploring the world of relationships. We've been looking at some of the issues in communications, when we communicate poorly, when we don't mean what we say, when we're not able to articulate what we need and what we want, how that might affect our relationships. And this week we were looking at communication the first week, and this week we're in a sense going back to that communication. We're going to be looking at the role of Tokhehah, and I'm going to define that in a minute. So if you don't know what that means, don't get stressed about it. We're going to be looking at the role of Tokhehah, the mitzvah, the commandment to give Tokhehah in a relationship. And so, of course, before we can even dig into thinking about Tokhehah, we have to try to define it. So it says in the Torah, Tochiach et Amitecha, which we're going to look at that inside the text. So you can just hear it orally, but I promise you'll see it in the source sheet in a moment. Tochiach, you hear that very guttural repetition sound there. So that means you shall surely give Tokhehah to your fellow. And so now it's hard to define. Normally, if you read a translation of it, it's defined as rebuke. You shall surely rebuke your fellow. The idea there is if you see someone doing something wrong, that you have an obligation to intervene and to say something and to call them out on their behavior. Part of what we're going to be exploring in this class is why. Why do we have this obligation to intervene and do this thing called Tokhehah? I feel like for our purposes, the English word rebuke, I think, has a pretty negative connotation. It's difficult to imagine rebuking loved ones in your life. That doesn't necessarily sound like something we want to be doing. So for me, the word that I tend to use when I think about Tokhehah is giving critical feedback. It's a little bit, Tokhehah, I think, is a little bit stronger than just feedback, because it's not just feedback in general. It's, I have critique on what you're doing. But I think for me, at least, defining Tokhehah as critical feedback makes it seem like something that I could imagine being a positive thing, something I can imagine engaging and working towards, but doesn't quite have the I think, a little bit of the off-putting connotation of rebuke. So we're going to be looking today at what it means to give Tokhehah. Why does the Torah tell us that Tokhehah is an important mitzvah, that we're obligated to give it? So some of the questions we'll be exploring are, how do you say when something is going wrong in a relationship? And should you always say something? Let's say that there's an issue in the relationship, someone is doing something that's bothering you. Should you always say something, as the Torah suggests that we're always obligated to say something? Or are there in fact times when it would be better to keep silent? And once you decide to say something, how do you decide how to speak and when to speak and with what words? Once you decide that you're actually going to give that Tokhehah, how do you go about doing it, which I think can be very difficult. And just thinking back to some of the texts we've already seen, I'll refresh your memory. In the first week, we saw that text between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, the ultimate chavruta and learning partner, where they get into sort of a disagreement in the Beit Midrash, and it ends up costing them not only their relationship, but their lives. So they both ultimately end up sort of dying in sadness over it, right? That's an experience where they got into a disagreement. But what would have happened? A little bit in that first session, we tried to attempt to how would you rewrite this interaction? How could you have pressed a pause button to have that disagreement go better? Another question would be there. What would have happened if either Reish Lakish or Rabbi Yochanan offered Tokhehah to one another? What would have happened if Reish Lakish had said to Rabbi Yochanan, when you call me a bandit, it really hurts my feelings and it's inappropriate and you shouldn't remind a person of their past, right? Well, how would it have changed their relationship if Reish Lakish had been able to offer that critical feedback? Or how would it have changed for Rabbi Yochanan if Rabbi Yochanan had offered Tokhehah to Reish Lakish in that moment? Same thing, we looked at a source last week on communication. That was the man from Babel married the woman from Israel, and they were having these miscommunication problems. He was saying, give me this thing, and she would give him that thing, and then he would get mad at her. There was no Tokhehah, there was no rebuke. What would it have looked like if he said to her, it really bothers me when I say one thing and you give me the other thing? And then she would have said, well, I actually was just doing exactly what I wasn't trying to upset you, right? It would have given her a chance to explain, or actually to say, well, really, I'm doing it because I'm mad at you for this other reason. That's something that was missing both in the first and the second week, is that act of Tokhehah that might have actually helped move the relationship forward. I think sometimes we think that Tokhehah, for me, certainly, giving Tokhehah, and I think receiving it, can be a very scary thing. It's something that we're hesitant to do, but sometimes I think Tokhehah can really be for the best of the relationship. So those are the questions we're thinking about. I want to ask you to think about, I'm going to share my own experience and my own personal experience with Tokhehah, but as I am sharing, I want to ask you to think about, just for yourself, think about a time in your life when you've either received or you've given critical feedback to someone. And think about a time that either went particularly well, you either gave it in a way that it was really well heard, or you received in a way that was really well heard, or it went particularly poorly, right? Think of a time in your life when either you gave or you received critical feedback and it either went really well or really poorly. And I want you to think about, what was it about that experience that made it either go so well or so poorly? What did you learn from that experience? So as I'm telling you my own experience of Tokhehah, you can just think about that. So my personal sharing around Tokhehah, it's hard to sort of narrow in on what the experience you want to share is. So my name is Avi, as you all now know, but I didn't always go by Avi. Avi is my Hebrew name. And so for many, many years, for most of my life, I did not go by my Hebrew name. And at some point in my early 20s, I realized that this was something that was important to me, and I started going by my Hebrew name. But I felt like it was a big ask to ask my family members to call me this Hebrew name that they weren't used to calling me. So for many, many years, everyone in my life, except my family, called me by my Hebrew name that I had started going by, except my family. And it was a little bit hard for me because, to be honest, I became rather attached to this name. I saw myself and identified as Avi, and everyone knew me as Avi. But again, I felt like I didn't want to push my family too hard on it. And, especially my mom, who had given me my name, my grandma, all of that. And my older sister as well. And it was always a little bit of a sore spot. That's something that I felt like I just had to accept for some reason. And then recently, probably and I never said anything about it. I never told anyone that it bothered me. I just lived with it. And a few years ago, my older sister, who's 5 years older than me, who I love very much, she has two kids who are about the same age as my kids, 2 and 5. And her kids, her babies, had started calling me not by the name Avi, the name that I go by, but my given name, and calling me Auntie, this given name. And it really bothered me because I felt like it was one thing for my sister or for my mom or from people for like 20 years, they knew me by this other name. It's another thing to then, the kids could have known me as Avi. That is the name that I go by in this world. And I felt like it was really disrespectful. And for me, it's so tied up in sort of issues of respect in my identity and who I am in this world that I felt it was really an emotionally charged issue. And so I really debated, but I really debated saying something. So this is the moment of like, how do you know when to say something and when to not say something, and for the sake of the relationship and how to say it. So I really debated. And finally I decided that actually the relationship was too important to me with my sister to not say anything. But the challenge there was getting myself to a place where I didn't feel so emotional, where I would be able to sort of give that critical feedback of saying, this is really important to me and it really hurts my feelings and I feel like I'm not being respected. So finally, the end of the story is I debated, I went back and forth. It was very hard for me to get myself to do it. And I finally said it to my sister. And I think she heard it and understood it. And I honestly thought that I was saying it for no reason, because I thought, well, the kids already now are calling me this other name. And sure enough, I saw the kids the next day, and the next day they were already anti-Avi. Like, it just took me being able to have the conversation. And of course, the kids were able to quickly adapt. So for me, what do I take away from that experience of sort of Tokhehah with my sister? I think something that is so important in my life is getting myself, once I realize that I want to give Tokhehah to someone, that I need to have that conversation, that there's something really bothering me. One is sort of, do I care about the relationship enough that it's worth it for me to have that conversation? And two is how to get myself to the emotional place that I'm able to communicate what I need to communicate carefully and thoughtfully and in the right words. That I think sometimes when we need to give Tokhehah, or we're upset about something, sort of we either we're too hurt or we're too angry, and then we're not able to have that conversation with the care. So that's just my own personal sharing to sort of start us off. And I encourage you to keep thinking about your own experience in your own lives and how you might bring that to this material. Okay, so I want to start off, I'm going to drop into the chat the link for the source sheet. So you can go on and open that up there. So the very first text, and I'll just say in terms of the use of the chat, there's going to be several times over throughout this is very much, to the extent that this is a Zoom class, I want it to be participatory and a conversation, and I really want to hear your thoughts and your experiences on this. So I invite you to use the chat whenever you want, and specifically there will be moments in the session where I'll turn to you and I'll ask a question and I'll wait for your responses in the chat. So please feel invited to use that feature. Okay, so hopefully you have the source sheet opened up in front of you. I'm looking at the very first source. This source comes from the Midrash, a collection of Midrashim on the book of Genesis. And so it begins, it says, V'hocheach Avraham et Avimelech. So there's that same, you hear the word for Tokhehah, V'hocheach, that Avraham rebuked Avimelech. So what's going on in the book of Genesis that Avraham rebuked the king Avimelech? The story there is Avraham suspects that the servants of Avimelech have stolen water from the wells. And Abraham is very upset about it. And he assumes that the servants are stealing the water, that obviously it must be coming from the king, from Avimelech. And so Abraham, in the book of Genesis, rebukes Avimelech. And what happens when Abraham rebukes Avimelech? Avimelech says to him, I think I actually have this line here. Avimelech says to him, I do not know who did this. You did not tell me, nor have I heard of it until today. So Abraham is so upset about this thing. He feels like he's been stolen from. And he finally rebukes Avimelech, and Avimelech says, I have no idea what you're talking about. No one told me about this. You didn't tell me about this. And I didn't have anything to do with it. And then Abraham accepts that Avimelech didn't have anything to do with it. And they make a pact. And they move on, and for the sake of the relationship, they're able to move beyond it. But this moment of Tokhehah, of rebuke in the Torah, is an amazing moment, because it's a moment where Abraham is upset with someone else for something. He thinks that he did something wrong. He confronts him, and it's through the confrontation that he's able to realize that actually the thing he's upset about didn't even really happen. Had Abraham not rebuked Avimelech, what would have happened? He would have gone on stewing. He would have gone on being angry. There would have been like a feud between their two kingdoms, and they never would have repaired it. But once they were able to just have that conversation, and Abraham said, why did you do this thing? I'm upset. Avimelech was able to say, I didn't do it, and they were able to move on. So the Midrash here is quoting that story. It's quoting that line where Abraham rebukes Avimelech. Okay, so Tokhehah Abraham and Avimelech. So Abraham rebukes Avimelech. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina. So Rabbi Yossi, the son of Chanina, said, "Hatochachat mevi'at lidei ahava." Tokhehah, critical feedback of rebuke, brings us to love. Sometimes you don't always think that Tokhehah is going to bring you to love. In fact, you're afraid that Tokhehah is going to push you away from someone. How do we know that Tokhehah brings you to love? As it says in the book of Proverbs, rebuke the wise and they will love you. And then it goes on to say, Hi da'ate de Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina de Amar, and this is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, the son of Chanina, that says, Kol ahava she'ein ima Tokhehah ina ahava. I love this line. He says, any love that doesn't come with Tokhehah is not real love. We're going to think about that for a second, because I'm going to ask you in a minute to respond to that. Any love that doesn't come with Tokhehah is not real love. I want you to think about whether or not you think that that's true, if you agree with that statement. And then we're going to go on and we're going to read one more statement. Amar Reish Lakish, keeping in mind, this is the same Reish Lakish from our very first week. This is Reish Lakish, the bandit who converts to a life of Torah, who becomes Rabbi Yochanan's study partner. They get in this heated debate and they get so upset with each other that they never talk to each other again. And ultimately, Reish Lakish dies of broken heart. This is the same Reish Lakish, okay? So what does Reish Lakish say here? Amar Reish Lakish, Tokhehah mevi'at lidei shalom. Tokhehah brings us to peace. How do we know that? V'chocheach Abraham et Avimelech, because Abraham rebuked Avimelech. Right? And had Abraham not rebuked Avimelech, they never would have formed that pact and they wouldn't have come to peace. Hi da'ate demar kol shalom she'eni ma Tokhehah eno shalom. And this follows the opinion that says any peace that doesn't have with it Tokhehah is not real peace. So this is a pretty strong statement on relationships, to say any relationship of love that doesn't have Tokhehah is not true love. And any relationship or any sort of peace that you come to that doesn't also have Tokhehah with it isn't real peace. I want to open it up to the chat. I'm curious to hear, what do you think about these two statements? Does this resonate with you? Do you agree with it? Does it feel true in your own relationships? Do you think this is true, that all relationships, all peace, all love also requires with it Tokhehah? So Joanne says, it is powerful and insightful. If you can't talk truth to a loved one through rebuke, then the relationship is not a strong relationship. It would be based on a false acceptance of their actions. Right, so I think I agree with Joanne here. I think that a part of when I think about giving Tokhehah in my life, a lot of times my decision to give it or not to give it is based on the strength of the relationship. Do I think that the relationship can handle the Tokhehah? Do I trust the person enough? And that was in the case of my sister. On one hand, it was really hard to say, but do I trust the person enough? Is it worth it enough to give that Tokhehah? David says, Tokhehah can also be boundaries, which are what we all need to establish: respect, love, and peace. Yeah. Gail says, I think there needs to be rules regarding how to give it. Absolutely, Gail. And so that's part of what we're going to look at. The first part of the session is establishing why is Tokhehah so important? And the second part is going to be, and how do we actually go about doing it? Shifi says, at times the person is too frail or dysfunctional to accept the rebuke. And so that's the other part of it, that on one hand, I really sort of agree with the sentiment of, it's not a real relationship if there's not Tokhehah there. On the other hand, people's relationships are very difficult. And it's like, I'm not always I don't know that I'm in a position to rebuke my 96-year-old grandma if my grandma does something that I don't quite agree with, right? That there's both, it could be a lack of kavod, of honor and respect, and that there actually might be moments and there might be relationships that are really deep relationships that you do really love that might not be appropriate to give Tokhehah in that format. Sometimes people we love don't have the capacity to receive the Tokhehah. If we understand that we can still have true love, but hold off in those areas, like others have said, right? So the question is both, so not only is the relationship strong enough, but do you give Tokhehah when you don't know if the other person is going to be able to receive it? What will it do to the relationship? It depends how it is delivered. If it's seen as criticism only, that is a problem. So the problem with Tokhehah, part of the question I would ask you is, what is difficult about giving and receiving Tokhehah? That it can be both difficult to receive it, certainly, but also can be quite difficult to give it, to figure out how to give it, in what tone, with what words. There are shades of rebuke, everything from could you put your stuff in the kitchen away to much bigger, right? The small and large ways that we rebuke people in our words and in our tones. So we'll just read one last comment. So Gail says it's very important. Sometimes it's more important to have shalom bayit. So it's interesting, right? On one hand, we're saying you need the tokhehah. Any shalom that doesn't have with the tokhehah is not real shalom. And on the other hand, sometimes you need to not have the tokhehah if you want to have the shalom bayit. So, and that I think is the really tricky thing, that on one hand, the Torah is commanding us to give tokhehah. Hocheach tokhech damitecha. You are surely commanded to give tokhehah. That we have to lean into. And on the other hand, we might feel the impulse to lean away from it because we're actually afraid of the distance it might put into our relationships. On the other hand, sometimes not saying the thing is actually what puts distance. Like in my situation with my sister, had I not said anything, that would have been the thing that brought the distance to the relationship. I needed to say something in order to lean into. And so I think what's so difficult with tokhehah is judging when is the tokhehah going to bring you closer, when is it leaning into the relationship, and when is the tokhehah actually going to bring you farther apart. Okay. And we have one more comment from Hoover that says, rebuke means that you care and wants to improve the relationship. Absolutely. I just want to note in terms of using the chat, just to be clear, you have the option to chat me privately or chat everyone. If you chat everyone, then I read your comments out loud. If you chat me privately, then I'm hesitant. You are saying something to me privately, so I'm not going to read those comments out loud. So just to be, if you do want your comment to be brought in, just to make sure that you're chatting everyone, so I know that you want those comments to be included. Okay, so much good Torah here in your comments. So with that, with the sort of like, we're now in this middle place of, does giving tokhehah bring us closer or does it bring us apart? I want to dive into the actual Torah commandment on tokhehah. Okay, so we're on the second source from Leviticus. So Leviticus says, "Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha." You shall not hate your brother in your heart. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. You shall surely rebuke your fellow. This is the line that I'm saying. Ve'lo tisa alav chet. So this is a very difficult verse to translate. That's translated a lot of different ways. I'll try to translate it literally, and then I'll try to say what else it might mean. That you should not carry upon him or upon the fellow sin. Lo tisa alav chet. I might wait to see. I might ask you to see what you think this means. Okay, so we have two things here. The first part is saying, don't hate the fellow. Shall surely rebuke. Don't carry a sin upon them in your heart. What do you think that second part might win? You don't carry a sin upon them in your heart. How do you understand that? And how does that relate to the first part about rebuking? What is the relationship between the commandment of rebuke and whatever this means? Don't carry a sin upon them. Any ideas how you would understand that? Okay, so Wendy says, don't hold a grudge. Right, so that's definitely good. So that's definitely connecting, good. So the not hating, why do you have to give tokhehah? Because otherwise you're going to hate the person in your heart. If you're in a situation of hating them in your heart, that's certainly the situation you need to give tokhehah and rebuke. Okay, great. Don't resent them, good. So that's connecting to, Amy says, if you don't tell the person, they may be unaware that they have sinned or hurt you. Don't be judgmental. So Norman says, rebuke in English has negative connotations. Is tokhehah always necessarily negative and confrontational, or can it be upbeat? Right, so that's a question, Norman. I think that's what's so hard about translating tokhehah as rebuke, is it feels it has such a negative connotation. I don't know if tokhehah can be upbeat. That might be pushing it, but I would like to get to a reading of tokhehah that is not always negative and confrontational, that I think that part of goes into how do we give the tokhehah? Is there a way to sort of give tokhehah, hopefully in a way that's at least neutral? I'm offering you something for the sake of the growth of you and our relationship. So yeah, Norman, I would like to move towards that. Marion says, don't assume a given response, to give people the chance to respond, as in the case of Abraham and Avimelech. Joanne says, gunning, sacking, building a case versus them without them knowing you have taken offense. Okay, good. So we're going to see all this come up. So Avi says silence is not golden. And Ria says, there could be a dangerous situation your friend has put herself in if you carry this danger. Not sure about the rest of that, but I think where you're going there is the tisal of chet that you're trying to translate, the carrying there. Okay, good. So let me give you, oh, good, Christine, let me read this because this is just, I'm going to read this last one and then I want to move on to the commentaries there. Resentment against someone else only carries a poison that erodes my soul. Amazing. So Christine and a lot of other people, you're already going into the reasons of why is it so important to give Tokhehah. So why is it so important to give Tokhehah? And so Christine is saying, why is it so important to give Tokhehah? Because otherwise I resent and hate that person in heart. And that's actually a poison that's eroding my own soul. So the question I would ask here is, why are we giving the Tokhehah? And I think why affects how we give it. Is the Tokhehah about the person is doing something wrong and I need to correct their behavior and I need to change their behavior, because otherwise if I don't change their behavior, I am carrying a sin for them. That's one reading. Someone else is sinning, but if I don't rebuke them, then I carry the sin on their behalf because I didn't stop them. Another reading of it might be someone is doing Tokhehah, someone is doing something wrong and I'm angry about it in my heart, and so I have to rebuke them, not for their sake, not to change their behavior, but for my own sake, so that I'm not stewing and resentful in my heart. Okay, so with all that, I want to go on and actually see how do the commentators understand this verse. So Ibn Ezra, a 12th century commentator, he says, why should you give Tokhehah? Oh, someone wanted me to share the screen. I will share my screen. I will try to share my screen. The reason why I don't tend to share my screen, wait, can I share? Yeah, I can. The reason why I don't tend to share my screen is because then I like to see all of you in the gallery view, so I see all of your faces. And when I share the screen, I don't get to see all your faces. So that's why I tend not to want to do that. But we'll try to do a little bit of screen sharing. So I'm going to share my screen now for you. But it looks like at the moment screen sharing is disabled. So we'll work on that. In the meantime, I'm going to keep reading with the sources and eventually I'll share my screen. Okay, Ibn Ezra. So he says, Tokhehah, you should surely rebuke. Why? This is the third source. Lest you suspected him of something and it was not so. And this is the explanation of, and you shall not bear sin for him, since if so, there would be a punishment to you for your sake. The way punishment works in the Torah is, if you accuse someone of doing something and it turns out that they didn't do it, then you get the punishment that they would have gotten had they actually done that sin. So this is a really literal reading of, so that you shall not bear the sin. Because if I accuse someone of doing something and it turns out they're wrong, then I'm going to carry the sin on their behalf when I'm ultimately punished for the thing I accused them of. So in this reading, why is it so important according to Ibn Ezra? Why do I have to do Tokhehah? One, because I might be accusing them of something falsely and it might not be true. But two, because it's going to come back to hurt me, because I'm going to get punished for the thing that I, got them accused of. So that's the Ibn Ezra there. So there's a self-interest in the Tokhehah. The Rashbam, the fourth source, says, Lo tisnat achicha bilbavecha, do not hate your brother in your heart. If he has done something evil to you, do not behave as if you continue to love him, all the time setting an ambush for him in your heart. And then the translation is a little bit loose there. In the Hebrew it says, lo tov. It's not good. The English says, such an attitude is unhealthy, which I think is a modern translation. Such an attitude is unhealthy, but rebuke him for what he has done. And as a result, you will restore kach yeh shalom, and there will be peace. I think that this is a powerful reading. The Ibn Ezra was concerned, what is the lo tisal chet, don't carry a sin? It's that if you accuse someone of doing something, and you accuse someone of doing something and they didn't really do it, then you're going to get punished for it. This reading is, it's not about anyone getting punished. It's about you're actually cultivating something. This is the poison that someone mentioned, Christine. You're cultivating something unhealthy in yourself. If you're stewing and hating someone, all the while acting like you love them, but you're setting an ambush for them in their heart, there's something very unhealthy about that. So why do you have to do Tokhehah? Both for the sake of the relationship, so there can be peace, but also for your own sake, because it's unhealthy for you to be continuing in this relationship when really you're so unhappy with the person. So that's the Rashbam, which I really like. And the Bechor Shor, that's the fifth source, the 12th century, he says, why lo tisna Tokhehah bilevecha? You should not hate your brother in your heart. If your brother does something that is difficult in your eyes, don't hate him in your heart. Rather, rebuke him and say, why did you do this to me? This is so powerful. This is what was missing from Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, that Reish Lakish didn't say, why did you say this to me? That's hurtful. Or in our case last week with the guy from Bavel, the husband and the wife and the lentils, that he didn't say, why are you doing this to me? Why are you doing this thing that is angering me? That no one bothered to say, why did you do this to me? So he's saying here, what the Bechor Shor is saying, don't be upset about it in your heart, but just say those words, Lama asita li kazot? Why did you do this to me? Since it is possible that he never intended what you had thought, or he couldn't help himself, or he will give you some other explanation. It's only when we come to ask someone that we can actually figure out what's going on in their heads and why it's happening. And through this, you will come to realize that he never did something improper to you. And in doing so, you shall not sin because of him. This is the translation of lo tisa l'avchet. There shouldn't be a sin because of him on you. And what is the sin that there won't be on you? The sin of having baseless hatred. Because when you think that someone did something wrong, first of all, someone said this in the comments, why do Tokhehah? To give someone a chance to explain. It invites a conversation, invites a moving forward. But if you think that someone did something wrong and you don't give them the chance to talk about it, you just assume their answer, then you go on hating them in their heart. And what is the lo tisa l'avchet, that you shouldn't carry a sin? It's the sin of that baseless hatred of hating them for no reason. So I think in these three different commentators, the Ibn Ezra that's focused on, well, the punishment's going to come back to you for falsely accusing, or the Rashbam that's focused on there's something unhealthy about it. You're acting one way, but really you feel another. The Bechor Shor that's saying you have to stop and ask. You have to invite the conversation so that you might be able to move forward, because really this is a misunderstanding. We see sort of three different perspectives for why the Torah is so concerned with Tokhehah. Okay, I want to pause there. That was a lot. I want to take a moment both to read some of the chats that were coming up, and also to give you a chance if you have thoughts or questions on what's just come up. So now is the time to use the chat. So Beth says here, more compassion, less judgment. That's a really great note, Beth. So when we're getting into the next part, the second part of this, which is once we decide that Tokhehah is important, how do we go about giving Tokhehah? So much of the time when we're giving Tokhehah, it's coming from a place of you did something wrong, or I'm mad at you. How do we give Tokhehah with compassion for the other person, with understanding, with sort of the hope that that we'll find another explanation, and without judgment of, you're a bad person and you did this to me to hurt me. I think part of what sort of I find powerful about the way the Bechor Shor is Lama asita li is he's not saying you're a horrible person, why are you a horrible person? He's saying, why did you do this thing to me? This hurt me. That compassion of where is this coming from? Right, so Joanne, again, comments on that. Notice the question that was in the rebuke. It's open to discussion rather than accusatory. So how do you open up that Tokhehah? Inviting a conversation as opposed to putting someone on the defensive. We're back to communication is key. Communication is always key. That says, even if they did something wrong, it's not up to us to judge them, which is so interesting. How can you, on one hand, you're in the position of being obligated by the Torah to give Tokhehah, but you're not being obligated to pass judgment on that. And that's a tricky position to be in. Resentment hurts only the person holding it. Good, so that's still going back to the Rashbam there, of that it's unhealthy to hold on to that. Well, if there's something you should have addressed a long time ago, but you waited too long out of fear or confrontation, what if there's something? Yeah, so that's really difficult. Meanwhile, the resentment lingers. That's part of it. And so that's what's really hard, is knowing when to address something. And if there's a statute of limitations on rebuke, of really the thing that you should have offered the Tokhehah and not happened a long time ago, you're still feeling upset about it, is even fair to the other person, 2 years later to bring it up. One thing I'll say is, that's the beauty of Jewish tradition of building into, we have this yearly opportunity with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to check in with those relationships and hopefully to say the things that are difficult for us. Yeah, Amy, I think that that's a difficult question of how do you have those difficult conversations very far after the fact. You know, in the case of my sister, what's happening after the fact? It had been happening for years that I was feeling resentful about it. And so I think that that goes back to trying to, you know, opening up as I'm doing this for the sake of the relationship. I'm not doing this because I think you're a bad person. I'm doing this because I actually really care. But I think that that's difficult. Okay. Okay. So given that the Torah says Tokhehah is important, it's a commandment, it's a mitzvah. Now let's acknowledge the rabbis know that Tokhehah is really hard to do, right? Some of you already brought those up in comments. Once we say we have to do Tokhehah, how do we do that? So let's look at source 6 together. So this comes from the Gemara. The tractate there is Arachim. So it says in the Gemara, Rabbi Tarpon says, I would be surprised if there's anyone in this generation who can receive rebuke. An amazing thing for a rabbi to say about his own generation. I would be surprised if there's anyone in this generation can receive rebuke. Why? Because if the one rebuking says to him, remove the splinter from between your eyes, this is like a sort of a rabbi metaphor language for like, you've done this bad thing, remove the splinter from between their eyes. The other one says to him, well, remove the beam between your eyes. This is a trading of rabbinic insults, right? But the point is that it's so defensive. I say to you, how often does it happen that you're like, you really think about it? Should I offer, should I really say something this moment, or should I not say something? You decide to say something, and the other person's like, well, you did this wrong. You're a horrible person. And so that's what's being captured here, that as soon as you go to give someone Tokhehah, the other person throws it back in your face so that no one is able to receive Tokhehah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria says, I would be surprised if there's anyone in this generation who knows how to rebuke. So Rabbi Tarpon says no one knows how to receive it. And now Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria is saying no one knows how to do it. Just take a look at this next source from the Sifra. The Sifra, source number 7, is a collection of midrashim on the book of Leviticus. So this is it's in the book of Leviticus that we had that Tokhehah et Amitecha. So it's a midrash specifically on that verse. So just skip down to the part of it that's in bold where it says Rabbi Tarpon said. So this is similar to what we saw in the previous source, but it adds an extra line. So Rabbi Tarpon said, in this generation, there's no one capable of rebuking. Interestingly, the filler there is because everyone is a sinner. That's a different way to understand it. One reason why no one might be capable of rebuking is because no one knows how to do it properly. Another might be because we're all guilty ourselves, that none of us are in a position to give rebuke to anyone because we are all sinners. That's another way of reading that. Rabbi Elazar ben Azaria said, in this generation, there's no one capable of receiving rebuke. And then this line is new for us. Rabbi Akiba said, in this generation, there is no one who knows how rebuke ought to be worded. I really appreciate the subtlety. It's similar to what Rabbi Tarpon is saying, that no one knows how to give rebuke, but that I think there's interesting that Rabbi Akiva is pointing out it's the language of rebuke, that when you are giving Tokhehah to someone, that you have to be so precise and thoughtful in the way you do it, really thinking out how do I need to say this so that the other person is going to be able to hear the Tokhehah that I'm giving. Okay, I'm going to take a moment. Feel free to chat in the chat now if you want to respond to either of those texts. I'm going to take a moment just to look at the comments. You know, someone asked the question, I think it's a very interesting question, why is it called giving Tokhehah? I never really thought about that before, the language. I mean, and that's my own translating here. It's not like a direct translation from like to give Tokhehah in Hebrew. And I think what I'll say to that is, why is it called giving Tokhehah, as opposed to like maybe like doing Tokhehah? I think there's a sense in which Tokhehah can be a gift if you receive it well. That goes back to the verse from Proverbs that says, rebuke, what did that verse say? Let me scroll up and see. Rebuke the wise and they will love you. That there's a sense in which Tokhehah, when given well and well received, it can be a gift that you're giving someone, because it can be the gift of realizing, oh, I was doing something wrong. Here's how I can be a better person. The question there is, how do we make Tokhehah a gift? That can be very difficult. Okay. So Susan says, giving Tokhehah from a place of humility and grace, not accusation and judgment, which is so difficult when you're caught up in the heat of a moment. How do you get to that place where you're able to give from humility and grace? Jody says, isn't this like giving constructive criticism? It is giving. Oh yeah, that's true, right? So that is maybe where I'm getting it from. Joanne says, does this commandment also refer to social justice type thing, not a sin or hurt to you, but calling them on something they've done in a larger community? Right, so that is, I think we might actually be seeing that text in our source sheet today, but we are gonna get into sort of the connection between Tokhehah and there's a text that we're gonna look at about the obligation to protest if you see someone doing something wrong, so absolutely. Barbara says, never rebuke when you are emotional. Okay, amazing, Barbara, so that's where we're gonna go. That's the next text I wanna look at. Okay, I'm gonna look at just this last comment. Is the one receiving the rebuke obliged to make sure the rebuker clarifies her statement? So what do you mean by? I love that. No one talks about that, but that's an amazing question, right? Because that's part of how it's difficult to receive the rebuke, that both then the one who is being rebuked then has to make sure before they go get defensive, right? Had, Reish Lakish said, you really hurt me by saying such and such a thing, does Rabbi Yochanan then reflect back and say, so what I hear that you're saying is I really hurt you when I called you a bandit? That part of, I think what's difficult is both the rebuker is so quick to rebuke from a place of anger or judgment, and the one receiving the rebuke is so quick to be defensive that we skip that step of clarifying and making sure we really understand. Absolutely. Okay, I'm gonna pause on the comments even though I wanna read them because I wanna make sure that we're moving through the sources. So keep those going in the chat. Okay. The Rambam. So look at section 3. We're on source 8 now. So this goes back to Barbara was saying, never rebuke when you are emotional, which is so hard to do because that's the moment when we want to rebuke someone. And that's that balance of, and this goes back to Amy's comment of how do we, on one hand, don't rebuke when you're emotional, but you can't wait so long that it's like, the rebuke is no longer relevant and it's years later. So how do you find that right moment? So the Rambam says, the Rambam is talking about different midot, different attributes that we want to cultivate in ourselves. And he says, anger, v'chen ha'ka'as midah ra'ahi ad lemeod. That anger is an attribute that is very, very bad. He says, it's fitting and appropriate that one move away from it and adopt the opposite extreme, that one should be the opposite of angry. It's interesting, most of when Rambam in general, when he's talking about midot, attributes, he talks about you always want to find a balanced and middle path. But with anger, he's saying anger is so bad, you don't even want to be the middle path, you want to be like on the other side. So then he goes on to say, if he should wish to arouse fear in his children and household, or within the community, if he is a communal leader, and wishes to be angry at them, to motivate them to return to the proper path, he should present an angry front to them to punish them, but he should be inwardly calm. He should be like one who acts out the part of an angry man in his wrath, but is not himself angry. Which is to say, sometimes when you're rebuking someone, when you're giving Tokhehah, when someone is really doing something wrong and they're not listening, he's saying you might need to actually play the part of angry, but you have to be very careful to play the part of angry while you yourself are inwardly calm. You should never actually be rebuking someone from a place of anger. I think about this text all the time. I have small children, 2 and 5, and it does sometimes, they're doing something wrong and they're doing it over and over and over and over again. And sometimes I intellectually make the decision, okay, I'm not even angry. I'm calm inside, but I make the decision, they're not listening to my calm voice. That's not working. So I'm going to switch to my angry voice so that they'll hear me and they'll listen. But when I switch to my angry voice, it makes me angry. And then I find that I'm really angry. And so I think about this Rambam a lot of how do I sort of switch to that, show the anger while remaining internally calm inside. And I think this goes back to, what Barbara and a number of other people were saying. It's so difficult for me, I find, when I'm thinking about, when I'm really upset about something, when do I give that piece of Tokhehah? I think it's finding that balance of giving the Tokhehah while you're still in the moment, while it's still relevant, but waiting until that initial emotion has passed and you're no longer giving it from a place of anger. That you have to be giving the Tokhehah from a place of, I care about you, or I care about the relationship. And it can be from a place of, I think you're a horrible person and I'm going to tell you all for what you've done wrong. Okay. we'll look at the next Rambam as well here. So the Rambam says, source number 9, he says, one who rebukes another, whether for offenses against the one who rebukes him or herself or for sins against God, should administer the rebuke in private. So that's number 1. It should be privately. Should speak to the offender gently and tenderly. That's sort of amazing. And that's what's so difficult about what if you actually have really good reason to be upset and angry, like you are indignant about something. And the Rambam is saying you have to find a way to speak to that person, even the person that you might be very upset about, gently and tenderly, and point out that the rebuke is offered for the wrongdoer's own good, to secure for the other a life in the world to come. This is sort of interesting there. This is the part of rebuke. This is the lo tisa la chet, that you shouldn't carry sin before him. This is the reading of rebuke, that why do we rebuke? It's for the sake of the other person is doing something wrong, and I care about that person, and so I need to correct their behavior so they don't go on sinning, and I want them to be able to get a place in the world to come. I think 2 things about this part of the Rambam. One, I think there's something so sort of like patronizing about it. Like if you were rebuking someone and you said, I'm doing this for your own good. Like I think that doesn't always go well in a rebuke when you're rebuking someone that way. On the other, so I would tread a thin line with that. On the other hand, what I think is very powerful here is the idea, why are you rebuking someone? What I take from the Rambam is not that you should be patronizing and say, I know best and that's why I'm rebuking you, but that the rebuke should be because you actually are invested in the other person and you care about the other person, not because you think the other person's a bad person and you want to yell at them. That it's about that you are able to speak to them tenderly because you're ultimately invested in them as a person. So he goes in, he says, if the person accepts the rebuke, well and good. If not, the person should be rebuked a 2nd and 3rd time. And so one is bound to continue the rebuking, the admonitions, until the sinner assaults the admonitioner, the rebuker, and says, I refuse to listen. This is a really powerful and strong statement that the obligation to rebuke is not just one time, but actually you have to rebuke multiple times, even to the point that the person almost lashes out at you. You still have to keep rebuking, he says. And then he says something else. Then he says, someone who has been wronged by his fellow and doesn't want to rebuke him nor say anything to him because the sinner is exceedingly common or not right in his mind. This is not really PC language here. I'm going to re-understand this as someone who doesn't want to rebuke someone because they don't think the other person is going to be able to hear it or is going to take it well. And the person forgave him in his heart and doesn't bear any ill feelings and didn't rebuke him. This is an act of special piety. But the Torah is only concerned about ill feelings. I think this part is really interesting because so far up to now, we've seen there's a really strong, push to, there's a mitzvah to rebuke. You always have to rebuke. You have to rebuke them till they slap you in the face. And now suddenly you hear, but actually, if you're able to forgive them and move past it in your heart, maybe you're not actually obligated to rebuke them. Because what is the Torah really concerned with? This sort of goes back to the Rashbam and the Bechor Shor we saw, the 2nd and the 3rd commentaries. What is the Torah really concerned with? The Torah is really concerned with you saying that you love someone, but actually hating them in your heart. It's really concerned with sort of that poisonous thing that you're doing to yourself, that's unhealthy. That's the problem here. If you're able to forgive the person and move past it, then maybe in that case, and you don't think the person will hear it, then in that case, you might not be obligated to rebuke. Okay, I want to look at one more source together, and then I want to pause and take your comments. So just look at the next source, source number 10. This comes from the Gemara of Tractate Yevamot. I think I'm going to go just to the bold there. So the second sentence, Rabbi Eli said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Shimon, just as it is a mitzvah for a person to say that which will be heeded, so it is a mitzvah for a person not to say that which will not be heeded. Rabbi Abba says, it is obligatory for him to refrain from speaking as it is stated, do not reprove a scorner lest he hate you. Reprove a wise man and he will love you. So this is really powerful. So up until now, the focus has been, it is a mitzvah. This is what we're told. It is a mitzvah. You shall always surely rebuke. And now suddenly there's actually a caveat. When should you rebuke? You should rebuke in situations where you think the rebuke is going to be heard. But if you know that that rebuke is not going to be heard, and you know that that rebuke is only going to make the relationship harder or going to make the person dig their heels even harder into the behavior, not only should you not rebuke them, you actually have an obligation to be silent in that circumstance. That there's an equal obligation possibly to rebuke or to not rebuke and to remain silent. And so what's really difficult is being able to assess what are the situations and relationships in which you think the person will be able to hear the rebuke, and when do you think they won't be able to hear it? Okay, I'm going to pause there. I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, and comments to any of those sources, and I'll go back and look at some of the things that people have been chatting. I just want to say, if I don't read your comment out loud, it's not because it's not an amazing, valuable comment. It's because there's so many comments and I can only grab out so many comments as I'm reading them. But I'm so thankful for all of your comments, and I know that all of you are reading each other's comments as well. Right, so Irene says, we need to let the offender know how the deeds made you feel, not that they are bad, which is, I think, is about that I language of this I'm just expressing how I feel, not that I think that you are a bad person. So Christine says, my students used to tell me that I never got angry, even when I corrected them. Then I realized that I always took on a calm before I spoke to them. Maybe intuitively understood that the students could not receive the lesson if I was displaying anger at their behavior. I have to say this is true. Even as I say that sometimes I make a decision to take on anger, I find that does not work. I think it actually is much more effective to take on calm, perhaps harder to do. So Christine, I think you may have mastered something that I'm still working on. Joanne says, many rabbis, I don't know if my or many, but rabbis' advice is count till 10 until you speak, time to think and select your words. Yeah, that makes sense. Rambam taking the stance of teaching and bettering them for their sake. Rochelle says, rebuke only to one who will hear is like not going to an empty well for water. I think I know what that means. Rochelle, I'd love to hear you say more about that. Right. That there's no point of going to an empty well for water. There's no point in rebuking someone who's not going to be able to hear you. Right. Assertive communication, Vivi, that sounds really great and very relevant to our sessions. Faith says, once the rebuke is accepted by the other person, you should move on to a peaceful relationship. And so that's very difficult. That's interesting. That's amazing, Faith, because you're bringing us back to that first text of once you give that rebuke and it's accepted, then it's on the rebuker. You have to be able to actually let it go and accept the shalom that comes with it and accept the ahava. You've done the work of the Tokhehah, and now can you let yourself move into the shalom and the ahava, into the love and the peace. Okay, amazing. I want to share with you. Yeah, okay. I'm debating this because we just have a few minutes left, but I'm going to do it anyway. I wanted to share with you one last text, which is a text to sort of show Tokhehah is just so hard to do. And not only is it hard to do in our own lives, sometimes the rabbis even struggle and the rabbis don't get it wrong. The rabbis get it wrong. So look at this last text. This is a real doozy to throw at you. So if this ends up being a poor educational decision, I apologize, but it's such a great text. So source number 12 in Masechet Sota. So the rabbis teach in the Gemara that it should always be the left hand, the weaker hand that pushes one away, and the right hand that draws near. That when you're pushing someone away, use the left hand, the weaker hand, and when you're bringing someone near, use the right hand. So the rebuking hand should be the left hand. And they say, who is this like? This is not like Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia. Who is Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia? Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia, he pushed one of his students away with both hands. Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia, a major rabbi, it's not that he pushed away with the left or the right. He actually pushed one of his students away with both hands. So now we're going to hear a story of what happens when there's a rabbi pushed a student away with both hands. So you can, we're going to skip that second paragraph, which is a bit confusing, and we'll go to the third paragraph. And basically what I'll say, just so you have the context, is that Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia and his students, included among his students was Jesus. Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia's student was Jesus. So they were on a journey, and they stopped at an inn, a tavern, on their way back from the journey. So that's the context we need to know for this. So when he was coming back to Eretz Yisrael, in that third paragraph there in the English, on the bottom of the page, Rabbi Yeshua arrived at a certain inn. The innkeeper stood before him, honoring him considerably, and they accorded him great honor. Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia then sat and was praising them by saying, "How beautiful is this inn?" Jesus, one of his students, said to him, "My teacher, but the eyes of the innkeeper's wife are narrow." This is a bit of a strange, there's different commentary on this on like, what did Jesus supposedly mean by this? But I think the one point is to say he's offering some sort of critique of the wife, the eyes of the innkeeper. But two, that he's looking at the wife of the innkeeper, which I think is more important for our student, that he's paying a lot of attention to the wife. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia says to him, his student Jesus, "Wicked one, is this what you are engaged in, gazing at women?" He brought out 400 shofars and excommunicated him, right? So he didn't, Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia, how does he rebuke Jesus for making, an inappropriate comment about a woman or maybe inappropriate looking? He brings out 400 shofars and in this exceedingly public way, with all this fanfare, excommunicates him. And so what happens? Every day, Jesus would come before him, but he would not accept his wish to return. And then poor Jesus, every day he comes before his teacher and he tries to do tshuva. He tries to return, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia won't take him back. What happens? One day, I assume, years down the line, Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia was reciting Shema, and Jesus came before him. Again, because Jesus is still trying to come back and trying to get back in. He intended to accept him on this occasion. Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia finally decided he was going to let him back. So he signaled to him with his hand to wait. Jesus thought he was rejecting him entirely. He therefore went and stood up a brick and worshipped it. Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia said to him, "Return from your sins." Jesus said to him, "This is the tradition that I have received from you. Anyone who sins and causes the masses to sin is not given the opportunity to repent." So what is the story? Jesus in the story does something a bit wrong, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia excommunicates him and rebukes him in the most public, sort of the loudest way possible. And every day Jesus tries to repent, and every day Jesus tries to come back, and he won't take him back. And finally, Rabbi Yeshua ben Parchia decides he's ready to take him back. And on that one day, he holds up his hand to say, "Okay, just wait." And Jesus has had it, because he's been rejected. He's tried to come back so many times. And on that day, he decides he's done. He's done with the rabbis. He's done with the Judaism. And in this story, he starts worshiping a brick. This is like the rabbis' comment on Christianity. But the point is to say that it totally severs the relationship. And after that moment, there was no coming back from Jesus. And then we all know what happened in Christianity, never comes back. I mean, this story is more about the rabbis' comment on Jesus. What I want to bring from this text is two things. One is you have even the greatest rabbis, they don't know how to do Tokhehah. Right? Even the greatest rabbis, here was a student, he had an opportunity to have a conversation with the student, to bring him closer. And what does he do? With 400 shofars, totally inappropriate, he pushes him away. And that that it continues, he continues to rebuke him, he doesn't let him back. And what is the result of it? That relationship is totally severed and the person turns away. Boy, did he blow it, Gail says. Exactly. And so I think for me, what I take from this, one, is just how difficult it is to do Tokhehah, and how, there's something sort of amazing that the rabbis are writing this story to show us that they get it, that they too are human and they struggle with it. And for me, my takeaway here is that it's a tricky thing. But I think all the Torah that you brought up here together, for me, what's most important about doing Tokhehah is that difficult balance of knowing, when does it bring us closer? When does it push us farther away? When do we speak? When do we not speak? And that when we decide to speak, sort of the care that has to go into it, of using the right words, of using the right tone, and doing it for the sake of the other person, for the sake of the relationship, and not for the sake of hurt and for judgment. Okay, I want to thank you all for coming along on that ride. That was a lot of text that we looked through today, and I'm looking forward to our next session next week. Thank you so much for all of your comments. I'm sorry I didn't get to read all of them out. I would have loved to have gotten to do the session with you in person, maybe some other time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rav Avi, and thank you everybody for joining us. It's so good to see everybody's faces. And just a reminder, on Sunday, we're back with Paul Lips at noon. Next Tuesday, back with Robbie Greengrass. And next Thursday, back once again with Rav Avi. So this has been a wonderful series. Thank you so much, Rav Avi. I've really enjoyed it. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.